Billionaire left a $1 tip, but what was written on the napkin made her cry. That's what everyone would later talk about, though no one saw the quiet moment when it happened. No one saw the way his hand hesitated before placing that single dollar beneath the coffee cup, nor how his eyes lingered on the napkin as if he was leaving behind more than just ink. The diner was nearly empty that night. The rain outside had turned the windows into shifting mirrors, blurring the neon lights of the street into streams of gold and violet. Inside, the hum of an old ceiling fan mixed with the faint crackle of a country song playing on the radio. The air smelled of coffee, cinnamon, and something tender, the kind of scent that reminded people of home, even if they no longer had one. At the counter, Emma wiped down the surface for the third time. She always did that when she was thinking, or rather when she was trying not to think. Working double shifts at Briarwood Diner didn't leave much time for daydreams. But sometimes, when the night slowed down, she caught herself wondering if there was still more to life than serving pie and pouring refills for people who barely looked up. That was when he walked in. A tall man in a charcoal suit, drenched from the storm, stepped through the door. His movements were sharp, deliberate, like someone used to controlling entire rooms with a single glance. The gold watch peeking from his sleeve didn't belong in a place like this. Neither did he. Coffee. Black, he said without looking at the menu. His voice was calm but carried a quiet exhaustion, the kind that came not from work but from life. Sure thing, Emma said, her tone gentle, unfazed. She noticed the way his tie was slightly loosened, his hair damp against his forehead. Most men who looked like that, rich, polished, often came with arrogance. But there was something different about this one. Something almost broken. As she poured the coffee, he stared out the window. The reflection of passing headlights flickered across his face, revealing eyes that looked both powerful and lost. She set the cup down. Rough night? He looked up for the first time. You could say that. Coffee helps, she smiled softly. At least that's what I tell myself every night. For a second, he almost smiled, almost. Then his gaze dropped back to the table. Emma didn't press further. She had learned that some people didn't want company. They just needed someone to see them. And so she went about her work, giving him space, but somehow, staying close, he stayed for hours, barely touched the coffee. Just sat there, sometimes writing something on his phone, other times staring at the rain like it held the answers to questions he was too afraid to ask. When he finally stood to leave, he pulled a few bills from his wallet, crisp, immaculate, and placed them neatly under the saucer. Emma waited until the doorbell chimed behind him before going to clear his table. She froze. There was a single dollar left as a tip, but next to it on the napkin were words written in slanted, deliberate handwriting. You reminded me what kindness feels like. Thank you. She blinked, unsure what to make of it. The handwriting looked controlled yet human, not rushed, not detached. She'd seen plenty of men leave cash and move on, but this was different. Something in that short message felt deeply sincere. For reasons she couldn't explain, she folded the napkin carefully and slipped it into her apron pocket. She told herself it was silly, that she was overthinking a simple note. But as the rain continued to fall, she couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't the last time she'd see him. The next night he came back. Same seat, same black coffee. No phone this time. Emma caught herself smiling when she saw him. Back for more of our world-famous burnt coffee? It's not burnt, he said. Honest coffee. I'll add that to the menu. A small silence lingered, but this time it wasn't awkward. He seemed less tense, though the weight behind his eyes remained. She wanted to ask who he was, what he did, what storm he carried behind that calm voice. But she didn't. Instead, she asked, So, do you always leave poetic notes for strangers? He looked at her, startled for a moment, then sighed faintly. I didn't mean for you to read it. I did, she said softly, setting down his cup. And it meant something. He studied her face then, as if trying to understand why a woman like her, someone who clearly worked too hard for too little, could still look at the world with such warmth. Most people wouldn't care about a stranger's bad day, he said. Most people just forget to look. That line stayed with him, more than he cared to admit. For the next week, he kept returning to the diner, every night, same time. They spoke in fragments, small exchanges about music, rain, life's unfairness, and the quiet beauty of ordinary moments. She didn't know his name yet, and he didn't ask for hers. But something unspoken began to build. Fragile, unintentional, real. What Emma didn't know was that his name was Adrian Cross, one of the wealthiest men in the city. CEO of Cross Holdings, a name whispered in financial circles with awe and fear. But sitting in that old booth with her, he wasn't Adrian Cross, the billionaire. He was just a man trying to remember who he was before the world turned him into something else. And she, without knowing, was the first person to make him feel human in years. That night, when he left again, there was another napkin beneath his cup. But this time, it wasn't a thank you. It was a question. Would you have coffee with me somewhere that isn't a diner? Her hand trembled as she read it, her heart unexpectedly caught between disbelief and curiosity. She looked toward the window, but he was already gone. Only the faint glow of the streetlights remained, and the quiet echo of something beginning. She stared at the question on the napkin for a long time, as if the ink might smudge into an answer. Outside, rain made ribbons of the streetlights. Inside, the radio murmured a song about staying when leaving would be easier. Emma folded the napkin and tucked it into her pocket, as Marley, the line cook, leaned through the pass. "Guy in the corner?" Marley asked. "The quiet storm with the watch? He tip weird again? He asked me to have coffee somewhere that isn't here," she said, trying for lightness and failing. Marley grinned. "Off-brand coffee, risky. You gonna go?" "I don't even know his name," Emma said. "For all I know, he's married to his silence." Marley's face softened. "You've spent a lot of years pouring into other people's cups. Maybe let someone pour into yours." He lifted a brow. "Carefully." That night, when she closed up, she found a small white card under the sugar caddy at his usual seat. No numbers on it, no name. Just a time and a place. 7 Monday. Ferris Park, North Gate. She smiled despite herself. He'd chosen neutral ground, somewhere no one could mistake their intentions for a transaction. She didn't tell anyone she was going. Not her mother, who would worry kindness into suspicion. Not her neighbor, who loaned her sugar and opinions. Monday came with a knife-edge wind and a sky the color of pewter. Emma wore her best winter coat, the one she saved for holidays and job interviews, and told her reflection not to expect anything except honesty. He was already there when she arrived, seated on the bench just beyond the iron gate, a paper cup steaming between his hands. Without the sharp lines of the diner's neon, he looked almost ordinary, almost. The kind of ordinary that takes years to learn, Emma, he said, as if trying out her name for the first time, letting it change the air between them. "So you do know mine," she said, amused and a little unsteady. "You wear it on your name tag," he replied, deadpan, and the joke landed gently between them. He held up the second cup. "I gambled. Cinnamon latte. You smell like cinnamon when you leave work." She took it, warmth finding her hands before it found her chest. "You notice a lot for someone who barely talks." "I talk more when words matter," he said. "Does this?" She lifted the cup. He considered her, rain freckling his lashes. "Yes." They walked. Ferris Park in February was a study in restraint. Bare branches black against a pale sky, joggers breathing fog, a carousel stilled under a tarpaulin like a secret waiting for music. Emma asked him nothing that pried and everything that mattered. "What calms you down? What makes you laugh? When did you last feel proud for something that had nothing to do with money?" He answered slowly, thoughtfully, with a humility that didn't fit the suit. "You always come in at the end of the night," she said. "Why?" "Because I'm worse at pretending when I'm tired." "Pretending what?" "That I don't need anyone." They sat on a bench. He kept his hands wrapped around the cup, as if heat was something you could hold on to. "I have to ask," she said finally, forcing herself past the softness of his quiet. "The dollar tip." "Most people would call that an insult, I know." He winced. "It wasn't meant as one. I haven't carried cash in years. I wanted to leave something tangible with the note, so it wouldn't look like I was just writing. Lines. You could have left nothing," she said. "The napkin was enough. I'm learning that." His mouth tilted. "I'm out of practice." "At being a person?" she teased. "At being known," he said. They traded pieces of themselves like kids swapping stickers, not haggling, just delighting in a fit. Emma told him about Briarwood Diner's owner, Gloria, who clipped recipes from magazines and taped them to the fridge like prayers. About her little brother, Noah, and his habit of sleeping with his calculus book on his chest, as if osmosis were an ally. About Thursday night regulars who told the same stories every week, and how repetition in kind voices can feel like a roof in a storm. "And you?" she asked. "Who tells your stories back to you?" He looked at the pond, at a duck cutting a V in the cold water. "No one lately. Get better friends," she said softly. He smiled at that. It changed his face like a locked room letting in sun. The wind bit through her coat, and he shrugged out of his scarf without theatre. She took it reluctantly and immediately, the wool carrying a scent of cedar and something clean. "What do you do?" she asked at last, because some truths you have to ask for even if they've already started to show themselves. He hesitated, and she watched the pause as carefully as the answer. "I manage a group of companies," he said carefully. "It's a lot. Is that why you look like you sleep with your eyes open?" She countered. He laughed. "Probably." They looped back toward the north gate. A street cart sent up steam and the smell of pretzels. A child dropped a mitten and announced it like the end of the world, until his mother made an adventure of finding it again. Ordinary life had a way of making room for itself around them, and Emma felt an ache she hadn't named in years' ease, just a fraction. "Can I ask you something?" he said as they stepped through the gate. "You already are. Why did the note make you cry?" She hadn't expected him to know. She looked at the pavement, then up at him. "Because I grew up thinking love was something people said when they wanted something back. Your note said thank you without asking. It felt pure." She exhaled, embarrassed by her own truth. "I think I cried because I didn't know strangers could be that tender. Maybe I didn't either," he said. They stood there, everything uncomplicated and more complicated at once. He glanced past her toward a cafe on the corner, warm light and clatter spilling out the windows. "Can we sit a little longer?" he asked. "No, He stopped, corrected himself with a small private smile. "Would you sit with me a little longer?" "Yes." Inside, the cafe felt like a postcard. Lamps with brass shades, a chalkboard menu, a barista with silver hoops stacked along one ear. They found a table near the back. The TV over the counter muttered low news, the captions a silent crawl. He ordered tea this time. She teased him about the betrayal of abandoning coffee, and his eyes sparked the way people's eyes do when they're being seen and forgiven for something all at once. The barista called out orders with names attached to drinks. "Hazelnut for Maya. Cappuccino for Dan." Each syllable a small invitation to reality. Then the barista said, cheerful, unbothered by the world, "English breakfast for Mr. Cross." Emma's hand tightened around her cup. She lifted her head slowly, hearing the name again in a room that kept being ordinary. Mr. Cross. The headlines she never read but couldn't avoid flashed in her mind. Mergers and markets. Layoffs and glass towers. Giant numbers attached to a surname that people spoke like a weather system. She turned to him and watched the color drain from his face, not with guilt, but with the dread of a man who knows a truth can open and close doors at once. "Emma," he started, but the TV above the counter, ignorant of timing, chose that moment to shift to a breaking chyron. The volume edged up with the crowd's attention. "Cross Holdings to announce major riverfront redevelopment. Sources Briarwood block under review." The word Briarwood landed like a rung breaking on a ladder. She could hear the cafe all at once and not at all. The hiss of milk, a spoon against ceramic, someone laughing like this was any other afternoon. Her throat went dry. "That's my street," she said, barely audible. He didn't look at the screen. He kept his gaze on her, eyes stripped of pretense. "I was going to tell you tonight. I should have told you in the park. What are you redeveloping?" she asked, even though the question was a ghost. She already knew its answer. "The board is pushing a plan," he said. "It's preliminary. It doesn't have to be Briarwood Diner." She said it flat like a diagnosis. "Gloria's place. The one with taped recipes and free pie for birthdays. The heart you've been sitting inside of for a week." His voice lowered, urgent and intimate. "I'm not the man you've read about. Not anymore." "That's the problem," she whispered, blinking fast. "I don't read about men like you. I pour their coffee. I watch their cars take the corner too fast." He reached for her hand across the table and stopped, leaving the last inch between fingers and fingers like a confession. "Let me fix it." "You can't fix what you plan to break," she said, standing even as part of her wanted to sit forever with the man he was in the park. "You can only choose not to break it." "Then I choose that," he said immediately. like a vow spoken in a church no one else could see. The cafe's door chimed. Two suited men stepped inside and scanned the room with professional eyes. His shoulders shifted, that involuntary square people carry when they've been followed by consequences a long time. Mr. Cross, one said, polite but immovable. Board call in 10. The press has the riverfront story. We need you upstairs. Emma watched him. The quiet man with the napkin and the $1 and the steady hands that tried to keep her warm. The headline, the board. The bench at Ferris Park under a pewter sky. If you walk out with them, she said softly, you answer to them first. If you stay, you answer to me. He looked at the men, then at her. The room seemed to lean in. Outside, the grey day brightened a shade, as if even the weather were waiting on his yes. He took a breath, and for once it sounded like choice. That night, Evelyn couldn't sleep. The image of the folded napkin with its single deliberate message haunted her mind like an unfinished song. It wasn't about the $1 bill. That was nothing. It was the words, the way they were written, the handwriting so precise, so controlled, like someone who didn't waste movements or emotions. She had spent the entire walk home wondering if she had somehow offended him, if the note was sarcasm or something deeper. Morning came with a heavy grey sky and the smell of rain. The city felt slower, quieter as she made her way back to the small diner on Elm Street, the one with the faded blue awning and the smell of coffee that never really left your clothes. She pushed the door open and was greeted by the familiar bell above it. Morning, Eve, called out Marta, the owner. A stout woman with kind eyes and too many worries. You're early again. Couldn't sleep, Evelyn replied with a tired smile. Guess I needed the coffee more than the rest of the city. As she tied her apron and checked the coffee pots, she couldn't shake the memory. The man, a tall, sharply dressed, a face too composed to be ordinary. She remembered the way he'd barely looked up, the way his watch gleamed in the dim diner light. He hadn't seemed the kind to leave a message like that. She reached into her pocket, pulled out the napkin again, and looked at the message. Some things are worth more than they appear. The words didn't make sense. Not yet. Around noon, the diner began to fill with the usual rhythm. Workers from nearby offices, old couples who ordered the same meals every day, a few college kids tapping on laptops. Evelyn smiled through it all, pouring coffee and listening to fragments of conversations she would forget by sunset. Then she saw him again. He walked in like he didn't belong there. Because he didn't. Same sharp suit, different color. This time a deep navy tailored to perfection. The diner's light caught on the cufflinks at his wrists. His eyes, dark, searching, flicked across the room before landing on her. Evelyn froze for half a second, her hand tightening on the coffee pot handle. He sat at the same table as before, quietly, purposefully. Coffee, right? She asked, approaching with a careful tone. He looked up this time. For the first time. His voice was low, smooth, and distant. Black, no sugar. Evelyn nodded. She poured. She wanted to ask about the napkin, but something in his presence made her hesitate. There was weight in the way he moved, like a man used to silence and authority. You were here yesterday, she said softly. He didn't answer right away. I was. Did you mean what you wrote? His eyes lifted, steady on hers. I don't write things I don't mean. The air between them stilled. Before she could reply, Marta called her from behind the counter, breaking the strange quiet that hung between them. Evelyn excused herself, her heart beating faster than it should. When she turned back again, the booth was empty. The coffee cup sat untouched, and beside it another napkin. Her hands trembled slightly as she unfolded it. This time the words were fewer. It's not about the money. She frowned, staring at it as though the ink might rearrange itself into meaning. She looked out the window, but he was already gone. By evening, the rain finally came, hard and unrelenting. The streets shimmered under the weight of it, neon reflections mixing with puddles. Evelyn stayed late, wiping tables and refilling salt shakers, her thoughts looping around the strange encounter. She was too practical to romanticize it, too grounded to believe in mystery. But there was something about him, something broken beneath the surface of all that control. She could feel it, though she couldn't explain why. As she locked up, Marta called after her. Be careful walking home, Eve, the storm's not letting up. I'll be fine, Evelyn said, slipping her hood over her hair. The city was almost empty when she stepped out, just the rhythmic echo of rain and the distant hum of passing cars. And then from across the street, under a streetlight blurred by rain, she saw him again. He was standing there, umbrella in hand, his eyes fixed on her through the haze. Evelyn's breath caught. He didn't move closer, didn't call out. He simply watched, his expression unreadable. Then without a word, he turned and disappeared down the street. The next day, she arrived early again, and for the third time, he was there waiting before the diner even opened. This time he spoke first. "You're early," he said, glancing up from his coffee. "So are you," she replied, trying to hide her nervous smile. "I could have waited until we opened." "I don't like waiting," he said quietly, "especially when I owe someone an apology." "An apology?" she repeated, confused. He leaned back, studying her with a calm that made her uneasy. "For the $1 tip," she laughed softly, shaking her head. "You don't owe me that." "I figured it was a joke or something." "It wasn't," he said simply. "It was symbolic." Evelyn raised a brow. "Symbolic of what?" "Of how little I used to understand value." His eyes met hers again, and this time there was no wall between them, just something raw and searching. "May I ask your name?" "Evelyn." "Evelyn," he repeated, as if trying it out. "I'm Nathan." She nodded slowly. "Nice to meet you, Nathan." "Likewise." He paused, almost hesitating, before adding, "You remind me of someone I used to know, someone who made me believe kindness wasn't a transaction." The words lingered in the air, heavier than they should have been. Evelyn didn't know how to respond, so she did what she always did. She smiled gently. "Well," she said softly, "coffee's on the house today." Nathan looked at her. Something unspoken flickering behind his eyes. Regret, maybe. Then he reached into his pocket, pulled out a small folded paper and left it by the cup again. When she opened it, her heart skipped. It wasn't a note this time. It was a photograph, a black and white image of a little girl holding a paper napkin. On the back, written in the same precise handwriting, were the words, "Kindness lasts longer than money ever will." Evelyn didn't know what it meant yet. But she knew one thing. This man, whoever he was, carried stories in his silence, and somehow she had just stepped into one of them. Nathan Vale hadn't walked into that diner by accident. The truth was far less romantic, far more calculated. At least that's what he told himself. He had built his entire life on control. Nothing in his world happened without reason, without precision. Every move, every word, every decision was deliberate. Yet when he found himself sitting at that cracked leather booth again, watching Evelyn refill someone's coffee with quiet grace, it didn't feel deliberate anymore. He had returned for something he couldn't define. Not yet. The city outside glittered through the window, but the light inside the diner was softer, gentler. It reminded him of a time long buried beneath boardrooms and stock prices. Evelyn didn't seem to notice the way his gaze lingered on her, the way he tried to memorize how she smiled at strangers, like they mattered. He wasn't used to that. In his world, kindness always came with a price tag. "Refill?" she asked, breaking his thoughts. Nathan blinked and nodded. "Please." She poured the coffee and glanced at him with curiosity. "You always sit at the same table, habit?" "Something like that," he said, his tone restrained. "I like routine." Evelyn smiled faintly. "Routine keeps us safe, right?" "Safe," he echoed, looking into the steaming cup. "Or trapped." She tilted her head, sensing there was more behind the words, but not pushing. That was what struck him most at her restraint. She didn't pry, didn't ask questions she didn't need answers to. It was rare. In his world, people chased after every crack in his armor. She didn't. She moved on to another table, leaving him alone with the hum of conversation and the quiet creak of the diner's old ceiling fan. Nathan unfolded the napkin she'd set beside his cup, plain white, unassuming, and smiled faintly to himself. He had started something, and now he wasn't sure how to stop. He reached for his phone, scrolled through a list of missed calls. His assistant, his lawyer, his ex-wife, all people who wanted something from him, all voices that filled his days with noise. But here, surrounded by the smell of coffee and the sound of Evelyn's laughter from the counter, the noise faded, for the first time in years. He could breathe. Later that day, as Evelyn wiped down the counter, Marta leaned close and whispered, "Your friend in the corner? He's back again. That's 3 days in a row. You sure he's not stalking you?" Evelyn laughed. "He's harmless, Marta, just quiet." "Quiet men make the most noise in the end," Marta muttered. "Trust me, I've lived long enough to know." Evelyn brushed it off, but she couldn't deny the thought that had been forming quietly in her mind. Why was he really there? As the shift ended and she stepped out into the cooling air, she saw him again, standing by the curb, waiting. "Nathan?" she said, surprised. "You don't strike me as the type to hang around diners after hours." He gave a small, rare smile. "You don't strike me as the type to give strangers free coffee." She crossed her arms, smiling back. "Maybe I'm just bad at business. Or good at being human," he replied softly. The rain had started again, a fine mist that blurred the streetlights into halos of gold. Evelyn pulled her jacket tighter around her shoulders. Nathan noticed, hesitated, and then, almost awkwardly, opened his umbrella. "Walk with me?" he asked. She hesitated. It wasn't a question most customers asked their waitress after a shift. But there was something in his tone, and not commanding, not expectant, just a quiet, human request. "All right," she said finally. They walked down Elm Street in silence, their reflections merging in puddles under the streetlights. The city's noise dimmed around them, and for a moment it felt like they were walking through a world suspended in time. "Can I ask you something?" she said after a while. "Of course. That first day," she began carefully, "the note on the napkin and the dollar. What was it really about?" He took a long breath. "I was testing something." "Testing what?" "Whether honesty still exists." His tone was calm, but there was an undercurrent of pain in it. "I've spent years surrounded by people who smile while they take from me. I wanted to know if anyone would give without wanting something back." Evelyn looked at him, her brow softening. "That's a sad way to live," he nodded. "It is." They walked in silence again. Evelyn could sense the weight he carried. Not arrogance, not pride, but exhaustion. Like a man who had built a castle only to realize it was a prison. "Did you find your answer?" she asked quietly. "I did," he said, glancing at her. "You gave it to me." The simplicity of the word struck her harder than she expected. She looked away, flustered. "You don't know me, Nathan. I'm just a waitress," he finished. "I know, but don't ever say just again. Not about yourself." The rain deepened and he held the umbrella a little closer to her. They stopped at the corner where their paths split. His car parked on one side, her small apartment visible in the distance. "Thank you for walking with me," he said softly. "Thank you for the umbrella," she replied with a faint smile. Nathan nodded, but he didn't move to leave. His gaze lingered, caught between wanting to say more and knowing he shouldn't. Finally, he said, "Evelyn, there's something I should tell you. About who I am." She smiled gently. "I already guessed. You don't wear watches like that unless you're rich." He blinked, caught off guard by her honesty. "But you're still a person," she continued. "Money doesn't change that." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and for the first time something in his expression broke. The cold composure cracked, revealing a man who hadn't been seen in a long time. "Most people don't believe that," he said quietly. "Well," she replied, stepping back toward her building, "maybe you've been looking in the wrong places." Nathan watched her go, her figure fading under the golden glow of the rain-soaked streetlights. His hand tightened on the umbrella. For the first time in years, he didn't know what his next move should be. When he got back to his penthouse that night, the city stretching endlessly beneath him, he found himself staring at a napkin on his desk, the same kind he'd used at the diner. He picked up a pen and began to write, slowly, deliberately. He didn't know why, but he knew exactly what he wanted to say next. Nathan Vale had never written anything by hand in years. His life was digital. Emails, contracts, signatures made with the glide of a stylus. Yet that night, he found himself sitting in the soft glow of his penthouse office, ink bleeding onto the napkin like the rain outside still hadn't stopped falling. He wasn't sure if the words came from his head or his heart, but they arrived steady, deliberate. "You reminded me what it feels like to be seen, not for my name, but for my silence." When he finished, he stared at the ink until it dried, folded the napkin neatly, and placed it beside his coffee cup. He wasn't planning to send it. It was just a thought, a confession meant for no one, or maybe for the version of himself that Evelyn had unknowingly awakened. By morning, he was back in his world, the glass towers, the boardrooms, the relentless clockwork of meetings and money. Yet something inside him had changed. His assistant, Clara, noticed first. "You're quiet today, sir." "Even for you," Nathan didn't respond. He simply looked out the window, his reflection merging with the skyline. "Just thinking," he said. "About the merger?" He hesitated. Something like that, but it wasn't the merger. It was her. The waitress who poured coffee with more grace than most people conducted business. The one who hadn't recognized his name, and when she finally did, hadn't cared. That kind of purity had no place in his world, and yet he couldn't shake it. That evening the rain returned, soft, rhythmic, the kind of weather that seemed to invite old feelings back to the surface. Nathan found himself once again sitting in the corner booth of the diner, his reflection flickering in the window's dim light. Evelyn looked surprised to see him. "Back again," she teased. "Routine," he said, smiling faintly. She poured his coffee and leaned on the counter. "You really like this place?" "I like the quiet," he replied. "And the coffee." She raised an eyebrow. "The coffee's terrible." "I didn't say it was good," he said, a small laugh escaping him. Evelyn laughed too, and for a moment it felt as if the diner itself was breathing easier, the air lighter, the tension between them unspoken but alive. "Rough day?" she asked. "Every day's rough," he said, then caught himself. "But this one, less so." "Then maybe you're doing something right," she said simply. Nathan looked at her, really looked, and for the first time in a long time, he wanted to tell someone the truth. About the loneliness that wealth couldn't cure. About how he built empires but lost himself somewhere inside them. But before he could speak, her boss Frank called from the kitchen. "Evelyn, order up!" She smiled apologetically. Duty calls. When she left, Nathan reached into his pocket. The napkin, the one he'd written the night before. He unfolded it, hesitated, and then carefully placed it under his coffee cup. When Evelyn returned, his booth was empty, just the faint warmth of his coffee left behind. She sighed softly. He always disappeared like that, quiet and contained. But when she lifted the cup, the folded napkin caught her eye. Her fingers brushed the ink. The message simple yet disarming. "You reminded me what it feels like to be seen, not for my name, but for my silence." Evelyn read the line twice, her heart tightening. She didn't fully understand it, but it felt sincere and rare. That night, she tucked the napkin into her apron pocket. Something about it felt too personal to throw away. Over the next few days, Nathan didn't return. She tried not to notice. She told herself he was just another customer, one of many faces that passed through the diner. But when the bell above the door didn't ring at his usual hour, the absence felt heavier than it should have, until one evening, a man in a charcoal suit walked in instead. He was older, polished, clearly from Nathan's world. He sat at the counter, ordered black coffee, and asked casually, "Does Mr. Vale still come here?" Evelyn blinked. "Mr. Vale? Billionaire Vale," he clarified. "Nathan Vale. He mentioned a diner with good coffee. I assumed this was it." Her mind froze. Billionaire. She had suspected he was rich, but that word, billionaire, landed like a blow. The man noticed her silence and smiled politely. "Don't worry. He's harmless if you don't count his inability to sleep." Evelyn forced a small nod. "I didn't know he owned half the city." "He owns most of it," the man said. "But he doesn't live in much of it." The words lingered long after the man left. That night, she stood outside the diner, watching the city lights pulse against the dark sky. Somewhere out there, Nathan Vale sat in his penthouse, a man surrounded by everything, yet craving something simple enough to fit inside a napkin. When she got home, she unfolded the note again, tracing the letters with her thumb. She didn't know why, but she whispered to the empty room, "You're not invisible, Nathan." Across the city, Nathan sat alone at his desk, staring at the skyline. He couldn't focus on the reports in front of him. Her voice, calm, unpretentious, replayed in his mind. The way she'd said routine keeps us safe still echoed somewhere in him. He reached for his phone and typed a message, then deleted it. Then typed again. In the end, he wrote only 4 words, "Are you still there?" He didn't send it. He wasn't ready to blur the lines between their worlds. Instead, he closed the message, turned off his phone, and whispered to the silence, "She's better off not knowing me." But fate, as always, had other plans, because the next morning, as Evelyn opened the diner doors, she found something impossible sitting on her table. A small, handwritten note, folded neatly, resting atop a freshly brewed cup of coffee. Her eyes widened. The cup was still warm. He had been there. Evelyn stood frozen by the counter, her breath catching as she stared at the note. The handwriting was unmistakable. Sharp, deliberate, slightly slanted like every word carried weight. Nathan Vale had been there quietly before the sunrise. Her fingers trembled as she unfolded the paper. Sometimes silence says more than presence. Thank you for both. It wasn't signed, but it didn't need to be. She could almost hear the restraint in his voice between the lines. The man who built skyscrapers couldn't find the courage to speak plainly to a waitress. And yet, his words had more honesty than anything money could buy. Frank's voice broke her thoughts. You okay, Eve? She blinked and folded the note quickly. Yeah, just early morning thoughts. Frank wiped the counter beside her. He's back, huh? That quiet guy, she hesitated. You noticed. Kid, he's the only man who drinks black coffee and leaves enough tip to pay our rent. Hard not to. She smiled faintly, though her heart felt heavy. There was a strange tenderness in the air, one she couldn't explain or share. That day passed slower than most. Every customer's face blurred, every sound felt distant. She found herself looking at the door each time the bell rang. But Nathan didn't come back. By evening, the city had swallowed another day, and the sky bled into copper and violet. Evelyn stepped outside, the air crisp against her cheeks. She turned the note over in her hands again, then tucked it into her coat pocket, as though afraid it might dissolve if left alone. Across the city, Nathan Vale was sitting at his private bar, surrounded by silence far louder than any conversation could be. He was supposed to be at a gala, shaking hands, pretending to care about numbers he'd already memorized. Instead, he sat staring at the untouched glass in front of him, replaying her voice in his mind. Maybe you're doing something right. He had lived his life doing what was right, for profit, for image, for control. But she had meant something else, something simpler, something frightening. Clara, his assistant, appeared in the doorway. The investors are asking where you are. Tell them I'm reconsidering, he said quietly. Reconsidering the deal? No, he murmured, eyes still fixed on the empty glass. Everything. Clara hesitated, watching the man who rarely hesitated about anything. You're different lately, Nathan. He looked up at her, expression unreadable. Different isn't always bad. That night he returned to the diner again, but this time he didn't walk inside. He stayed across the street, under the dim light of a street lamp, watching through the fogged window. Evelyn was there, cleaning tables, humming softly to herself, unaware of the way her small world was now haunting a man who owned half the city. He saw her stop by the booth he always sat in, the one by the window. She glanced at it briefly, as if expecting him to be there. Then she smiled to herself and went back to work. Something in that simple act shattered his restraint. The next morning, when Evelyn arrived to open the diner, she found an envelope waiting for her at the door. It had no name, just the faint imprint of rain across the paper. Inside, there was a letter, not handwritten this time, but typed formal, deliberate. To the staff of Charlie's Diner, effective immediately. The ownership of this establishment has changed hands. The new owner intends no layoffs, no policy changes, and no interruptions to business. All current employees are to retain their positions. Signed, Vale Holdings Group. Evelyn's knees weakened. Vale Frank came up behind her, reading over her shoulder. Wait, Vale? As in Nathan Vale? She couldn't answer. Her heart was pounding too fast. Frank let out a low whistle. Why would a billionaire buy this place? Her throat tightened. She didn't know. But a part of her feared she did. That night the diner filled with whispers. Reporters stood outside, cameras flashing, hungry for a headline. Billionaire buys local diner. Mystery behind sudden purchase. Evelyn kept her head down, serving coffee as usual, pretending not to notice, until the bell above the door rang. Nathan Vale walked in. The chatter died instantly. The air shifted. He wasn't in one of his immaculate tailored suits, just a dark coat, its open collar, sleeves slightly rolled as though he'd left his armor behind. He looked around once, then straight at her. Good evening, Evelyn, he said, voice calm but laced with something heavy. She froze, tray in hand. Mr. Vale. Just Nathan. She blinked, unsure what to say. Why are you here? I think you already know. The words carried weight. Regret, intention, maybe even hope. The other customers pretended not to stare. Frank, bless him, decided that now was the perfect time to check the kitchen inventory and disappeared. Evelyn set the tray down slowly. "You bought the diner?" He nodded. "It seemed worth preserving." Her jaw tightened. "Oh, you mean owning?" "Protecting," he corrected softly. She crossed her arms, the first flicker of anger pushing through her confusion. "You can't just fix everything with money, Nathan." He stepped closer. "I didn't do it to fix anything. Then why?" His answer came quiet, almost fragile. "Because you reminded me what kindness looks like, and I didn't want the world to take that away from you." Evelyn stared at him, unsure whether to feel grateful or betrayed. "You can't just buy a piece of my life to feel something real." Nathan flinched slightly at her words. "I didn't buy you, Evelyn. I bought a place where I remembered what being human felt like." The honesty in his tone softened her anger, but didn't erase it. "I don't know what you want from me," she said quietly. "Neither do I," he admitted. "But for once I want to find out." Before she could answer, another voice called from outside. Reporters shouting his name, cameras flashing through the glass. Nathan turned toward the noise, jaw tensing. "I should go." She watched as he pulled on his coat, the distance between them growing heavier by the second. But just before stepping out, he paused and looked back. "Don't throw away the notes." Evelyn's eyes widened. "How do you know?" I just do," he said. And then he was gone. The door closed behind him, and the diner fell silent again. Only the faint ring of the bell lingered, and in it, the sound of something beginning. The next few days unfolded like a dream Evelyn hadn't chosen to wake from. The diner was suddenly spotless, the coffee machines replaced, the neon sign outside restored to its original glow. Everything was new, yet she felt a strange ache for the cracks and stains that had once told stories of her quiet life before all this. Customers multiplied. Reporters came and went. Everyone wanted to sit where Nathan Vale had sat, that booth by the window, now polished and shining like a monument. But for Evelyn, it was a reminder that her peace had been bought, and she didn't know how to feel about that. Frank, ever the optimist, chuckled while wiping glasses. "You know, Eve, I never thought I'd say this, but I don't mind being part of a billionaire's diner. The new coffee beans alone are worth it." She tried to smile. "You mean you don't mind until cameras show up again?" He shrugged. "Publicity is good for tips, but between you and me, I still don't get what he's after." Neither did she. Late that night, long after the last customer had left, Evelyn stayed behind. She locked the doors, turned off the lights, and sat at his usual booth. Her hands rested on the table, tracing the grain of the wood. "What are you doing, Nathan?" she whispered into the quiet room. A voice answered from the shadows. "Trying to be a better man." Her heart stopped. She looked up. He stood by the doorway in a charcoal coat, face softened by exhaustion. "You shouldn't sneak in like that," she said, though her voice had lost its strength. "I didn't want an audience." He moved closer, the golden light from the sign outside catching the tired blue of his eyes. "You're angry with me." "I'm confused," she replied. "Why me? Why this place?" He sat across from her. "Do you believe people can change?" She frowned. "I think people can try to." He leaned forward. "I wasn't always like this. The press paints me as cold, untouchable. Maybe they're right. Somewhere along the way I stopped believing kindness mattered. Until you handed me a cup of coffee and asked nothing in return." Her eyes softened, but her voice stayed steady. "That doesn't mean you owe me your redemption." "Maybe not," he said quietly. "But I owe you my gratitude, and I don't know how to show it except by giving something back." "You don't have to give anything," she said, shaking her head. "That's not what kindness is." Nathan smiled faintly. "You're right, but maybe it's what love could become." Evelyn froze, the words hanging in the air between them. He didn't mean to say them. She could see it in his eyes, but once spoken, they couldn't be unsaid. She looked down at her hands, her pulse quickening. "You don't know me, Nathan. I've spent my whole life surrounded by people I knew too well," he said, "and none of them ever made me want to stay." The silence that followed was heavy but not cold. She met his gaze and for the first time saw not the billionaire the papers worshipped or feared, but a man stripped of his armor, afraid of how much he'd already lost. She wanted to look away, but she didn't. Finally, she said softly, "You should go before someone sees you here." He nodded but didn't move. "Will you meet me somewhere else?" "Not as the owner and the waitress, just as two people trying to figure out why this feels impossible. Her chest tightened. Nathan, this isn't a fair world. People like you don't have the luxury of being ordinary. Then maybe that's exactly what I want, he said. She closed her eyes, torn between fear and something dangerously close to longing. When she opened them again, he was still watching her, not with the sharpness of a man used to control, but with the tenderness of someone finally surrendering. I'll think about it, she whispered. He nodded once, stood and slipped his hands into his pockets. Before walking out, he left something on the table, a folded napkin. After he was gone, Evelyn stared at it, heart pounding. She hesitated before opening it. One line, handwritten, "Don't let the world convince you that good people finish last." She didn't realize she was crying until a tear fell onto the ink. That night, she didn't sleep. Every thought spun around the same truth. She had built her life on quiet honesty, while his had been carved from noise and power. And yet somehow they had collided. The next day she arrived early at the diner again, but this time Nathan was already there, sitting by the window, waiting. He looked different, not in his clothes or demeanor, but in the stillness of his expression. "You came," he said quietly. She placed 2 cups of coffee on the table. "I said I'd think about it." "And?" She sat across from him. "I think you're not used to people saying no to you," he smiled. "That's true. Then maybe it's time someone did." He leaned back, eyes searching hers. "You think I'm here because I can't have what I want?" "I think you're here because you don't know what you want," she said gently. Her words hit him harder than she knew. He looked away, his jaw tightening as if holding something back. "You might be right," he said. "But when I'm here, I feel closer to figuring it out." Evelyn hesitated, then said softly, "Then stay. Not as the man who owns the place, but as the one who needs to remember what being human feels like." He looked back at her, surprise flickering in his eyes. "You'd let me?" She nodded. "Just don't leave napkins next time. If you've got something to say, say it." For the first time he laughed, and quietly, genuinely. The sound was enough to draw glances from the few morning customers who hadn't realized who he was. It felt wrong and right at the same time. Like the start of something they both knew they shouldn't want, but couldn't stop from happening. Outside, the city began to stir. Another day, another layer of secrets waiting to unfold. And inside the diner, 2 worlds were slowly beginning to blur. Days blurred into weeks. And yet Nathan kept returning to that same booth by the window. Not as the billionaire owner of the diner, but as the man who drank his coffee slowly, listening to the quiet hum of a world he'd never really noticed before. Evelyn served him without ceremony. No flattery, no fear, just steady hands, honest eyes, and words that made him question everything he thought he knew about strength. He started arriving earlier, staying longer. Sometimes he'd sit there while she cleaned up, watching her hum to an old song playing through the dusty speakers. It wasn't the tune that captivated him. It was the way she carried herself. Graceful, grounded, unaware that her gentleness was changing the air around her. Frank noticed, of course. He leaned over the counter one evening as Evelyn restocked cups. "You do realize that man's falling for you, right?" Evelyn froze. "Don't start. I'm serious," he said, lowering his voice. "He looks at you like you're the first thing that's ever made sense to him." She sighed. "Nathan Vale doesn't fall for anyone. Men like him, they collect experiences. They don't keep them." Frank shrugged. "Maybe he's tired of collecting." She gave him a look that said, "Don't give me hope," and went back to wiping the counter. That night, Nathan stayed past closing again. He'd offered to help clean once, but she'd laughed. "I can't imagine you holding a mop," she said. He'd smiled then. "I've held worse things, contracts, lies." She didn't know what to say to that, so she poured him another cup of coffee instead. As the minutes stretched, their silence became something fragile but alive. Finally, Nathan spoke. "Do you ever wish you'd lived a different life?" Evelyn looked at him, surprised by the question. "Sometimes," she admitted. "When I was younger, I thought I'd be a teacher, maybe even travel. But life had other plans, and now I try to be grateful for what I have," she said softly. "Even when it's not what I wanted." Nathan nodded slowly. "I envy that. You? The man who has everything." He met her eyes. "That's the problem, Evelyn. I have everything except peace." Her breath caught at the vulnerability in his voice. It wasn't performative. It was the quiet confession of a man stripped bare, she said, barely above a whisper. Then stop running from it. He looked down at the table, tracing the rim of his cup. You make it sound simple. It's not, she said. But it's possible. The clock ticked behind them. Outside, the city lights painted the wet pavement in gold and blue. And in that silence, something shifted. Not loud or dramatic, but deep enough to change them both. The next morning, Nathan didn't come. Or the next. By the third day, Evelyn pretended not to notice, but Frank did. Looks like your favorite customer's gone ghost, he teased, though his tone carried concern. Evelyn smiled faintly. He's not my anything. But when she turned away, her hands trembled slightly. That night, she lingered by the window after closing, watching the street. The same booth where Nathan had sat looked too empty. The steam from his usual cup, black coffee, no sugar, no longer clouded the glass. A part of her hated how much she missed that silence between them. When he finally returned a week later, he looked different, not tired, hardened. His suit was darker, his tone quieter. Evelyn, he greeted, but his eyes didn't hold the same ease as before. You disappeared, she said. I thought you forgot where we were. I could never forget, he said. But I had to deal with something. He didn't elaborate and she didn't ask. But she saw the shadow behind his eyes, the kind that didn't come from lack of sleep but from guilt. She poured his coffee and placed it in front of him. Whatever it is, I hope it's worth looking that miserable over. That made him laugh, but it wasn't the same laugh as before. It wasn't, it never is. As he lifted the cup, she noticed something. His hands were shaking slightly. Nathan, she said quietly, you don't have to keep pretending everything's fine. He looked at her, his jaw tense. If I stop pretending, I'll fall apart. Then maybe it's time you did. Her words hit him harder than she knew. He leaned back, exhaling like someone who'd been holding their breath for years. You don't understand, he said. People like me aren't allowed to break. Evelyn folded her arms. You're not people like you here. You're just a man who looks like he needs a friend. That silenced him. He studied her, the dim light outlining her face, her simple uniform glowing faintly under the hanging lamp. She wasn't glamorous or powerful, yet she carried a kind of dignity that made the room feel sacred. He set the cup down slowly. You keep saying things that make me want to stay. She smiled gently. Then stay. And he did. Hours passed long after the closed sign went up. They talked about books she loved and countries he'd visited but never seen. He told her about his father, the man whose empire he'd inherited but never understood. He built walls, Nathan said. Not houses, not homes. Just walls. And I learned to live behind them. Evelyn's voice softened. Then maybe it's time to open a window. He looked at her, really looked, and something inside him broke open, just enough for light to slip in. When he left that night, he didn't leave a tip. He left a folded napkin again. This time it read, You make me want to be honest. Evelyn held the napkin in her hand long after he was gone, her pulse trembling in her throat. She knew she was in trouble. Because for the first time in her life, she wasn't just curious about someone. She was falling for him, and in the stillness of that diner, she understood something Nathan hadn't yet. Love doesn't ask for permission. It just happens. The next week brought rain, the kind that blurred the city lights into watercolor streaks. The diner was quiet, nearly empty when Nathan walked in again. His hair was damp, his tie slightly loosened, and the look in his eyes said he hadn't slept. Evelyn felt her chest tighten. She tried to sound casual. Rough day? He gave a low laugh. Rough week? Maybe rough life. She poured him a coffee without asking, sliding the cup across the counter. You don't strike me as someone who complains. I don't, he said. But lately, I'm not sure if staying silent is strength or cowardice. Evelyn studied him carefully. Sometimes silence is the only thing left when words don't fix anything. He looked at her, a small trace of gratitude in his expression. You always say something that makes sense. You have no idea how rare that is. She smiled faintly. It's called listening. Nathan chuckled under his breath. Then the world needs more of that. The conversation drifted to small things. Music, the way the city smelled after rain, the regulars who never changed their orders. But beneath every word, there was a current neither of them could ignore. It was quiet, steady, and dangerously alive. When the last customer left, Evelyn locked the door and began wiping down the counter. Nathan didn't move. He sat there, eyes following her with a look that made her nervous and comforted all at once. "You're different, you know that?" he said softly. Evelyn turned. "Different how? You don't want anything from me." "I don't need anything from you," she said simply. He nodded. "That's exactly what I mean." For a long time there was silence, the kind that fills a room when something deeper than conversation begins. Nathan stood, walked to the window and looked out at the rain. His reflection shimmered faintly in the glass. "My father used to tell me emotions were weaknesses," he said quietly, "that they cloud judgment. That's how he built an empire, by shutting them off. I followed him for years. I became exactly like him." Evelyn's voice was gentle. "And now?" He turned, meeting her gaze. "Now I look at you and realize he was wrong about everything." Her breath caught. She wasn't prepared for that, not from him. She searched for something to say, something to anchor them back to reality, but all she managed was, "Nathan." He took a slow step forward. "You've done something to me, Evelyn. You've made me see things I didn't even know I'd lost." Her heart pounded. "Don't say things you'll regret." "I won't regret this," he said, voice low, almost pleading. "For once in my life, I'm not lying." The words hung between them like lightning before thunder. Evelyn shook her head, half afraid, half drawn in. "You're a billionaire, Nathan. I'm a waitress who can barely pay rent. You don't belong in this world and my world." He stepped closer. "Maybe your world is the only one that ever made sense." Her pulse raced. The nearness of him, the warmth in his voice, the sincerity that broke through his usual armor, it all felt too real. But then, something flickered across his expression, hesitation, maybe fear, and he stepped back. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "You're right. I don't belong here." And just like that, he left. The bell above the door rang softly as he disappeared into the storm. Evelyn stood there, staring at the empty space he left behind. Her hands were trembling. That night, she couldn't sleep. She replayed his words again and again, until they stopped sounding like something said in the moment and started feeling like a confession. The next morning, when she arrived at the diner, something was different. There was a car parked outside, sleek, black, and unfamiliar. Inside sat a man in a suit holding a briefcase. "Evelyn Hart?" he asked as she approached. "Yes?" "I'm with Vale Holdings," he said, handing her an envelope. "Mr. Vale asked me to deliver this." Her stomach dropped. "He's not coming back, is he?" The man's expression softened. "I wouldn't know, ma'am. But he asked me to make sure this reached you personally." She took the envelope with shaking hands. It was heavy, sealed with gold foil. Inside she found a letter, written in Nathan's unmistakable handwriting, and a check. The amount made her breath hitch. It was enough to buy the diner, pay off her debts, and live comfortably for years. But it wasn't the money that made her cry. It was the note that came with it. "You taught me kindness doesn't have a price, but I'm still learning how to deserve it. This isn't payment. It's a promise that someday I'll come back as the man you believed I could be." Her tears fell onto the paper, blurring his name at the bottom. She wanted to be angry. She wanted to tell herself this was just another story of rich men and broken promises. But deep down she knew Nathan wasn't running away. He was trying to rebuild himself. Days turned into weeks. The booth by the window stayed empty. The coffee pot hissed, the radio played, and life went on. Until one morning, Frank came running through the front door, newspaper in hand. "You need to see this," he said breathlessly, pointing to the front page. Evelyn took the paper and froze. The headline read, "Nathan Vale shuts down his father's corporation. Donates fortune to workers' fund." Below it, a photo of Nathan, standing in front of reporters, eyes clear, suit simple. He didn't look like the billionaire she'd met. He looked human. Frank grinned. "Looks like someone took your advice." Evelyn smiled through tears. Maybe he just remembered who he really was. But as she looked out the window, she couldn't help wondering, would he ever come back? And if he did, what would they be now? That question lingered in her mind all day, until closing time, when the bell above the door rang softly. She turned, her heart stopping mid-beat. Nathan stood there, drenched from the rain, a familiar napkin in his hand. He said only one thing, "Can I have a cup of coffee?" The coffee machine hissed, the smell filling the small diner like a memory returning home. Evelyn stood frozen for a moment, unsure whether to speak or breathe. Nathan's presence felt like a dream, or perhaps a haunting. His hair was damp from the rain, his once polished shoes scuffed, but his eyes were calm in a way she had never seen before. "You're back," she said softly, trying to steady her voice. "I promised I would be," he replied, his tone carrying a warmth that seemed foreign to the man she remembered. She reached for a cup and began to pour, her hands trembling slightly. The silence between them wasn't awkward this time. It was heavy with all the words they had left unsaid. He sat at his usual booth by the window, the same place he used to watch the world without really being part of it. She placed the coffee before him, their hands brushing for just a moment, enough to send a quiet spark through her chest. "I'll find the ocean." She smiled through her tears, switched off the lights and stepped into the quiet street. The city that once felt too big now seemed small, almost gentle. The wind carried the smell of rain and salt, faint, like a promise waiting to be kept. And somewhere far away, under a sky of burning gold, a man looked toward the horizon and smiled, because he knew she would come. Subscribe if you believe that love still changes people, not because it's perfect, but because it makes us human enough to start again.